The afternoon they buried my father. The sky was so gray that the air above the small Halpern family cemetery in suburban Greenwich looked like a sheet of cold metal slowly lowering itself over the bowed heads in black. Wind came in off the lake and moved through the bare elm trees, carrying the smell of freshly turned earth, white lilies, and damp wool from the cashmere coats people wear to funerals in families rich enough that even grief gets framed inside good manners. I stood to the left of the front row, just far enough from my father's coffin that no one could force me to perform the role of the grieving daughter the proper way, and watched my stepmother, Victoria Halpern, place one slim hand, still wearing my father's sapphire ring, on each mourner's arm as if she had just lost the great love of her life instead of stepping into the one phase she had been waiting for through 11 years of marriage. Victoria wore a perfectly tailored black suit, her hair pinned low, her lipstick so pale it was almost non-existent, her eyes just red enough to look believable. She did not cry out loud. She did nothing crude. That was the first thing I ever learned about Victoria. The most dangerous people in families like mine are never loud. They are composed, gentle, patient enough that other people start to feel rude for doubting them. When the last of my father's old business partners stepped away from the chairs and moved toward the grave to drop in the first handful of dirt, Victoria leaned slightly toward me without looking directly at me, letting her lips barely move beneath the black netted veil. "Your father would have wanted this handled with dignity," she said. Her voice was low and soft, exactly the voice of a woman trying to keep a funeral from being ruined by too much emotion. I looked at the profile of her face, the blade-fine line of her jaw, the black velvet collar sitting perfectly in place, and felt that old familiar coldness slide down my spine. Not because it was a direct threat, but because that was how Victoria always opened her attacks, with a reminder about dignity, about what was proper, about behavior, as if anyone who refused to submit to her plan automatically became crude, ill-bred, selfish. Before I could answer, she had already turned to take the black umbrella from the driver, lifted the hem of her dress clear of the mud, and taken her place beside the coffin as though the house, the accounts, the shares, the keys, the files, and above all the stone house facing the south garden, the one my father had always said would be my home, had all slipped neatly into the pocket of her coat the moment his heart stopped. That was the first moment I saw something colder than the grief beginning to settle over the air after my father's death. Victoria was not only mourning, she was controlling the scene. And in families like ours, the person who starts controlling the scene at the funeral is usually the one who began moving before the dirt over the grave had time to dry. My name is Lena Halpern. I was 32 the day my father died, and 33 the day I understood that losing him had not even been the worst thing that would happen to me that year. People like to think stories about stepmothers and houses belong to ugly fairy tales, the kind where greed wears red lipstick and laughs too loudly. Real life is much worse than that. Real life gives you a woman who remembers the name of your allergist, who calls to ask about your neighbor's old cat after surgery, who brings soup when someone is sick, who knows how to sit in exactly the right patch of light at Easter Mass so she looks like the embodiment of composure, and then uses all of those qualities as leverage when it is time to pry something out of your hands that had been promised to you long before she entered the house. My father, Richard Halpern, married Victoria when I was 21, in my senior year of college. My mother had died when I was 13, pancreatic cancer, quick and clean in the most merciless way, leaving me with my father, a man in commercial real estate in Connecticut, courteous, dry, loving me the way men of his generation so often loved daughters. Not with many hugs, not with many words, but by making sure tuition was always paid on time, remembering to change my tires in October, driving 60 minutes himself just to bring me a spare key after I called him from outside my dorm at midnight. He was not an easy father, but he was home according to the only definition I could still believe in after my mother died. The stone colonial in Riverside, with its low white columns, dark blue shutters, cherry-paneled library, and arched window looking out over the rose garden, was where I learned to ride a bike, had chicken pox, hid to cry after my mother's funeral, and sat for hours on the stairs listening to my father talk on the phone about land deals, as if hearing him speak about zoning permits and easements was enough to keep the house from collapsing under the absence of my mother. He used to tell me over and over, not in grand pronouncements, but in the plainest moments, standing at the kitchen window watching snow fall, taking me to inspect a newly repaired roof, finding me sitting on the living room floor with college brochures because I was too tired to go upstairs. "This house stays with you, Lena, no matter what else changes." I didn't record him. I didn't make him sign a napkin. I didn't imagine I would one day have to tear through every corner to prove that a promise had truly existed. You do not do that with your father when you still believe family is the place where memory can hold up spoken truth. My first and greatest mistake, it turned out, was having grown up inside that feeling longer than was safe. Victoria entered our lives through a charity ballroom in Stamford and moved into the house faster than anyone I had ever seen. She was 12 years younger than my father, had previously worked as a development director for a private hospital, knew how to smile at exactly the right person, when to lower her voice, how to use the sentence, "How are you really holding up?" in a way that made people feel truly seen. In those first months, I wanted to hate her in the simple way a girl hates any woman who arrives too soon after her mother's death, and before she is ready to share the house with someone else. But Victoria never gave anyone that kind of easy target. She did not try to become my mother. She did not steal my mother's things. She did not redecorate too fast. She never asked me to call her anything except Victoria. She kept the white linen tablecloth my mother loved, remembered exactly which tea I drank in winter, draped a gray cashmere throw over the back of the sofa in the living room because she had noticed me falling asleep there 2 nights in a row during midterms. Some women understand that the most efficient invasion is an invasion carried out through usefulness. Within a year, Victoria's presence was everywhere in the house without ever looking like intrusion. The flower arrangements she chose were in exactly the right places. My father's newer dinner, guests laughed louder at the table. The old staff began saying Mrs. Halpern in a tone that already sounded practiced, and my father, who had lived alone inside his hard shell longer than was healthy, softened. He smiled more, went to bed earlier, fell less silent at dinner. Time I was in Boston, then later back in New York working for a commercial interior design firm, coming home on weekends but no longer living fully inside that house. So the changes happened slowly enough that each time I truly noticed one, it had already finished happening. That, too, was one of Victoria's gifts. She never took anything in one abrupt motion. She let other people get used to losing ground, then called the process maturity. In the years after that, my father slowed down. Not all at once, not dramatically, just age plus a mild heart attack at 70, and a bypass surgery that made him start thinking about wills, trusts, tax exposure, long-term care. All the words rich people use when they want to call death by a name that sounds manageable. I began hearing the house mentioned more often in little father-daughter exchanges, always on the edge of other things. Once, around 8 months before he died, he took me down to the basement to show me the wine cabinet he had just had retrofitted for humidity. And while we stood in the smell of cedar and old Bordeaux, he said, as if picking up a sentence he had started years earlier, "You know the house is yours. The rest can be sorted around it." I asked if he had told the lawyer. He raised an eyebrow, irritated in the way he always was when asked something he considered obvious. I told him years ago, "Should I have some kind of copy? Why? Am I dead already?" I laughed, apologized, slipped my hand around his arm, didn't push further. Again, I chose to behave like a daughter, instead of someone preparing to defend herself against an enemy I still wasn't willing to name. I did not know Victoria was standing at the end of the upstairs hallway at that exact moment. Only much later, when I started looking back at old memories the way you look back at security footage after a theft, did I assemble how many times Victoria happened to be nearby whenever papers, assets, or the house came up. She never interrupted. She only listened, only remembered, only waited. My father died on a weeknight in the upstairs bedroom, after 3 days of the flu turning into pneumonia and then acute heart failure. A death that wasn't grand or poetic, just fast enough to leave behind nothing more useful than a few broken instructions about medication, and one very weak squeeze of my hand when I bent close to his face. Victoria called me at 4:17 in the morning, her voice broken to exactly the right degree, and told me to come immediately. I drove from Manhattan back in the damp dark, both hands locked on the steering wheel, no radio, no tears, only a silence packed so thick in my ears it felt like cot. When I arrived, the bedroom lights were on. Half the bed linens had already been changed. The private doctor had left through the side entrance, and one of the house staff was crying in the pantry. Victoria wore a silk robe the color of ash, her hair loose, her eyes red, but she had already reassembled herself. She hugged me on the upstairs landing, held me longer than usual, the pressure of her hand between my shoulder blades just enough to seem supportive, but feel more like placement. "We'll get through this," she said. I didn't answer. I went into the room, looked at the bed now missing the shape of my father, and the first thing I felt was not pure grief, but a physical absence, as if someone had pulled the main support beam out of the entire structure of my life. Without my father, the house still had walls, floors, paintings, clocks. Those roses cut too beautifully outside. But the moral axis that had made me believe I still had a right to stand there was gone. And Victoria understood that faster than I did. By that same afternoon, when I went downstairs into the study looking for funeral paperwork, and saw her sitting at my father's desk, laptop open, landline beside her hand, the keys to the main house and the safe room laid neatly on the leather surface, I heard the first instinctive warning form into actual language. Victoria looked up, gentle in a way that should have alarmed anyone. "I'm just trying to put things in order." Her voice was smooth, soft, over-rehearsed. I looked at the keys. "Those are my father's keys." Victoria tipped her head slightly. "Our house needs structure now, Lena. Not this house. Not his house." She had changed the possessive noun on the very first day. That was the moment she began behaving as if the house had already been hers for years, and my father's death had simply been the final administrative step. The funeral, like all rich family funerals, spent the energy of the living on endless small details called respect, but mostly designed to keep the social machinery from stalling. I chose flowers, approved the eulogy, turned down some local reporters, answered calls on behalf of relatives. Victoria cried just enough, wore the right shade of charcoal gray 2 days in a row, let other people see her tired but never disordered, and began bringing up the house very early in ways that made dissent sound cruel. "This place is too much for one person. Your father always worried about long-term upkeep. I don't know if I can stay here alone." She said those things in front of the florist, in front of some cousin from Westchester, in front of the family lawyer while signing papers with the funeral home, as if scattering seeds for a story that would later grow into something that sounded self-evident. By the 5th day after the funeral, when the 9th casserole had been delivered, and the last of the people who came to pay respects had begun drifting back into their ordinary routines, Victoria walked into the kitchen while I was leaning against the counter drinking cold coffee, my eyes burning from lack of sleep, and said in the tone of someone mentioning lawn service, "We need to talk about the house." I didn't answer at once. The way she kept using "we" made me nauseous. "What is there to discuss?" Victoria set down her espresso cup, lowering her eyes with exactly the correct degree of widowly restraint. "We need to be practical." I looked at her. "My father was clear with me about the house." The faintest blink. "Just one. Your father said many things when he didn't want conflict." "Victoria." She looked at me directly for the first time all day. "The house belongs to me now. No music, no crash." Just one sentence delivered so calmly that anyone listening from the doorway could have believed it was already an established legal fact instead of the first knife she had just pressed into bone. I stared at her long enough that she had to repeat herself in another register, which is to say in the register people like Victoria always use when the first cut hasn't gone deep enough. "Your father changed things," she said, "toward the end." "No, Lena, grief makes memory unreliable." "Are you saying I remember it wrong?" Victoria lifted one shoulder just slightly, as if she did not want to insult me, only regretfully remind me of something obvious. "I'm saying your father was trying to protect me, and honestly, protect you too. This house is an asset, not a shrine. People who gaslight will never deny everything. They shift the floor half an inch, just enough that you begin to wonder if you are the one not standing straight." I went straight down to the study and searched the file cabinet my father always used, the third drawer on the right where he kept copies of the deed, insurance riders, trust summary. It was empty, not stripped bare, just selectively cleaned out, the way someone removes exactly what she needs and leaves enough scattered paper behind so the drawer does not sound hollow when opened. I called Jonathan Pierce, the family lawyer, got his voicemail, called the office back. His assistant said he was reviewing the estate materials. I asked when I could see him. She told me Victoria had scheduled something for the following week. Victoria, not me, not both of us together. I lifted my head from the phone and found her standing in the doorway of the study, her arms crossed loosely, wearing a cream cashmere sweater, that sympathetic expression she used with people being inconvenient at gallery openings. "You need rest," she said, "not paranoia." That was the first time I truly heard the word paranoia hanging between us like a warning. No one rewrites your reality faster than someone who wants to take what belongs to you while still keeping the posture of refinement. Over the next 7 days, papers began disappearing in a way that, for the first time in my life, made me feel my memory being pried apart in layers. The red folder in the safe room that once held an old copy of the deed was gone. The recessed cabinet key hidden in my father's desk drawer had been replaced with a new lock. The file on the roof, repair 8 years earlier, which contained a section naming me as successor with authority to access the property during my father's extended travel, was gone too. Martha, the longtime housekeeper, stopped meeting my eyes. The gardener told me Victoria had ordered the gate code changed on the second day. Separately, any one of those things could be explained. Stacked together, they started to look like someone doing more than clearing papers. They looked like someone rewriting the map of a house's memory. I stared at drawers that had been reorganized, binders put back in an order completely unlike my father's, and heard a sentence rise in my head with painful clarity. Someone had not just moved papers. Someone was rewriting reality. When Jonathan Pierce finally agreed to see me, he received me in his dark wood office overlooking Greenwich Avenue with the expression older good lawyers, where when they know they are standing between law and loyalty. He rested one hand on a folder, removed his glasses, exhaled slowly. "Victoria has provided a revised estate packet." I stared at him. "Revised? Your father updated certain dispositions. When? 6 months ago. He never mentioned it to me. Not everything is discussed with adult children in advance, Lena." Something in the way he said adult children made me want to sweep the whole pile of files off his desk. "Did you watch him sign it?" I asked. Jonathan didn't answer right away. "The documents appear regular." "That is not an answer." He looked at me, and then, for the first time since I had walked in, looked away. That little aversion was the true sound of panic. I understood at once. He wasn't sure. And in a world where everything lives or dies on signatures and timing, uncertainty was the first crack. My father's relatives, like all old money relatives, responded to inheritance conflict in the exact way that can drive a person mad. Politely, vaguely, always leaning just slightly toward whichever version of order looks strongest in the moment. Aunt Judith from Darien came for tea with Victoria and called me emotional, understandably. Uncle Owen in Philadelphia texted that the house was a lot for a single girl to manage alone. A cousin I had seen exactly 3 times in 10 years posted a black and white photo of my father on Facebook with a caption about keeping family legacy undivided, as if legacy were something people invoked only when they wanted someone else to shut up. When people see a gentle widow sitting in the house with red eyes and a handkerchief, saying her husband's daughter is hurting too badly and is beginning to see things through distortion, while that daughter tears through paperwork, asks for copies, speaks more sharply every day, guess who they believe? By the end of the second week, I began to understand I was not only about to lose the house. I was losing the right to narrate what exactly I was losing. That is the deepest layer of gaslighting in family property wars. The person taking from you does not just want the asset. She wants exclusive claim to victimhood. Victoria achieved that through a softness so calculated it was nauseating. I heard her in the kitchen with Aunt Judith, her voice low enough to sound accidental, but loud enough that I could still hear from the pantry. "I think Lena is struggling more than she admits. Richard always worried she'd attach too much meaning to objects. Objects. She called the house where I grew up, where my mother died, where my father promised over and over that I would keep it objects." I stood there in the smell of dish soap and cinnamon from the pie someone had just sent. My hands clenched until they hurt, and understood that isolation becomes a hallway built very quickly when the person constructing it has the right kind of voice. But Victoria had one weakness that many smart manipulators still have. She was too sure that the one hurting more would react louder. She thought I would scream, cry, pound doors, spill the ripped-open parts of myself in front of everyone, and in doing so prove my own instability. What she hadn't counted on was that if someone hurts long enough, eventually she stops caring about being believed right away. She only cares about digging. The first crack did not come from a major document. It came from a detail so small that if I had not been raised in that house and looked at my father's signatures all my life, I might have missed. In the packet Victoria had passed through Jonathan The codicil supplementing the will was dated May 17th. I saw something wrong in that date before my mind could explain why. Where had my father been on May 17th? I stood in the dark garage near midnight, scrolling through an old calendar backed up to iCloud, then opened my photos. On May 17th of that year, my father had been in Nantucket with me and a local broker to inspect damage to the roof on the summer house. I had a photo of him outside the boathouse in a gray windbreaker holding a coffee cup, time-stamped 11:48 a.m. Codicil said it had been signed at Jonathan's office in Greenwich at 10:30 that same morning. Could he have made it back in time? Maybe. But then I remembered the more important thing. That same day, he had gotten an injection of muscle relaxant for chronic shoulder pain, and I had driven for him that entire afternoon because he could barely move his left arm. I sat there in the dark, phone screen throwing light into my face, hearing my heart land hard as if someone had placed something solid on a table. Maybe that detail alone would not win a case, but it was enough to make me stop arguing and start digging like someone looking for something buried very carefully. That was the point when I stopped trying to persuade Victoria to return reality to me. I understood I was going to have to excavate it myself. I started with people who had been around longer than paper. Martha, the housekeeper who had been with us 26 years, said nothing at first. She dodged direct questions, kept saying, "I don't want trouble," and glanced toward the doorway as if Victoria might appear through will alone. I didn't push. I brought her almond cake from the old bakery my mother used to love, sat with her in the laundry room watching the dryer spin, talked about things that had nothing to do with the case. Her knee pain, the late daffodils this year, her daughter's divorce. At minute 37, when she stopped feeling interrogated and began sliding back into memory, she said the first important thing on her own. "He didn't sign any papers with her in May," Martha said, still looking at the sheets she was folding. "That week he argued with Mrs. Victoria in the study about something. They almost never raised their voices." I looked up. "What did you hear?" Martha swallowed. "Just one line. He said the house is not part of this." That sentence moved through me like electricity. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Then she looked at me for the first time, and the next day she told me to carry a box of papers down to the furnace room from the study. I didn't look inside, but I saw her go down later to check the ashes herself. I sat very still, feeling nauseated and awake in the most terrible way. Women like Victoria do not merely destroy evidence. They stage the destruction. They stand beside the furnace and watch paper turn into ash so they can hear the old world vanish. From Martha, I found another path. My father's former accountant, Harold Green, retired 2 years earlier but still keeping personal backups of property tax files and homeowner coverage documents, because he never fully trusted anyone else to store them properly. I drove to New Canaan to see him one drizzling afternoon, to a small house that smelled like dusty books and ointment for aching joints. Harold looked older than I remembered, his hands trembling slightly, but his mind was still sharp as nail. When I told him I needed to cross-check the historical title file and writers on the main house, he didn't ask why. He just stared at me for a long moment and said, "It's Victoria, isn't it?" I laughed, dry and exhausted. "Can everyone see that?" He shook his head. "No, only people who do numbers for people who do charm long enough can see the difference." Harold pulled a gray document box from a drawer. Inside was a scanned writer from the second year after my father married Victoria. In the special provisions section related to the residential property, there was a handwritten line in my father's familiar blue ink. "Primary residence reserved for transfer to L.A. outside spousal commingling structure." It wasn't the deed. It wasn't a silver bullet, but it clearly proved that my father had intentionally kept the house structurally separate from the marital estate, at least through one stage. Harold also gave me an old printed email between him and Jonathan about segregating the house file from marital umbrella exposure, sent 3 years before my father died. I held those papers and felt hope come back in the ugliest form. Small, shaky, fragile enough to hurt worse if it collapsed, but it was enough to make me stand a little straighter. Victoria had not just lied about my father's intention. She had known exactly what she was doing, and known it for a long time. I confronted her again in the library, where my mother had once read historical novels, and my father had signed the biggest contracts of his life. The late afternoon light came through the deep wine-colored drapes in dark red blocks across the Persian rug. Victoria stood by the gas fireplace, one hand holding mineral water, the other touching the back of her neck like someone worn down by stress. I did not circle around anything. You forged it, didn't you? Victoria did not startle. That was her coldness. She only turned slightly, looking at me the way a teacher looks at a student speaking beyond her own understanding. I'm sorry, the May codicil. The deed packet. You forged it or you knew it had been altered. A thin silence. Then Victoria smiled very faintly, the saddest smile she had. Lena, grief is making you dangerous to yourself. You're not denying it. I'm saying you are crossing into something ugly. Ugly, I repeated. You burned my father's papers. Victoria tipped her head. And now the housekeeper is a witness. This is what you're doing? I stepped closer. You forgot one detail, the day he supposedly signed it. You think dates prove intent? I think dates ruin liars. Victoria's face changed for the first time. Not quite fell apart, just thinned enough for the harder thing beneath to show. You have no idea what your father promised me, she said. I know exactly what he promised me. You were a child when those fantasies were planted. I laughed, and there was nothing joyful in it. You always do that. You call other people's memory fantasy and your own hunger sacrifice. Victoria set down her glass and walked directly toward me. She was half a head shorter than I was, but could make the air contract with nothing but tone. Your father owed me protection. I gave him 10 years when he was half dead inside. I kept this house alive. I kept him functioning. I kept the social side of his life from collapsing. You came and went. You had your city, your career, your distance. Don't walk in now and talk to me about what belongs to you as if belonging is some sentimental relic children inherit for free. She delivered all of that in a voice no louder than someone ordering dessert. That was what made it frightening. The most dangerous people are the ones who can throw their own greed in your face and still sound like they're delivering a reasonable argument. I looked at her, and for the first time I did not feel afraid. Only clear. So it's true, I said. You know you're stealing. Victoria smiled, thin as paper. Prove it. I hired a lawyer the next day. Not Jonathan, obviously. Not anyone in Greenwich who had ever eaten at our table. I needed someone who was not afraid of being shut out of 3 golf clubs and 2 hospital boards. I found Maya Feldman in White Plains, a probate litigator known for having once dragged a billionaire uncle into court and beaten him with the emails he thought he had deleted. Maya was around 40, black hair pinned back low, eyes that never wasted time on anyone's appearance. Her office was not beautiful. The chairs were a little hard. Coffee machine sounded like it was dying. I liked that instantly. I told her everything, from the things my father had always said to the old writer, Harold's email, the suspicious codicil, the emptied file cabinet, the burned papers, and the way Victoria was running the relatives like a private PR campaign. Maya listened, tapped the edge of her pen against the desk. Okay, she said. Here's the good news. She's either a liar, a thief, or both. The bad news is liars with good posture often win the first 3 rounds. I almost laughed because it sounded truer than anything consoling anyone had said to me for 2 weeks. What do I do? Maya leaned forward. Stop reacting like a daughter. Start behaving like a plaintiff. That split me in the strangest possible way. I had spent those 2 weeks as a daughter trying to pry memory out of another woman's hand. Maya asked me to change roles, build a timeline, identify who had access to what and when, pull medical records for May 17th, demand discovery on all estate revision, check the old camera system around the study if the server still existed. And one more thing, she said as I was standing to leave. From now on, don't ever argue with her alone again, unless it can be recorded or witnessed. People like her feed on live emotion. Don't feed her. The legal war did not begin with the sound of a gavel. It began with thick white envelopes and polite sentences strong enough to ruin sleep. Maya filed a petition to halt transfer of the house and open discovery on capacity, authenticity of the codicil, and the chain of custody of the property file. Victoria struck back quickly, almost aggressively. A big Manhattan firm took her case and sent us a packet 3 times thicker, including affidavits from 2 signature witnesses. A physician's statement saying my father had been lucid and oriented in May, and a brand new copy of a memorandum of intent stating that he intended to leave full residential discretion to his spouse. Everything was plausible enough to keep me awake the first night. I spread it across the table in the temporary apartment I had rented in Stamford. If you have never entered a property dispute against a skilled manipulator, you might think truth, once you have it, is stronger than a lie. It isn't. In real life, truth is only raw material. Whoever tells it first frames it more beautifully, or makes the other person look like she is acting out of unprocessed grief wins a great many early rounds. Victoria called Aunt Judith herself, called the church circle, called two of my father's old friends, speaking in a tired voice about how she never imagined Lena would do this while I'm still sleeping in Richard's shirts. One of my mother's friends called me hesitantly and asked whether I might be letting grief drive litigation. By the third week, I realized I was not only fighting to reclaim the house. I was fighting not to be nailed in place, as the selfish daughter dragging a grieving widow into court out of jealousy over my father's final love. That was Victoria's greatest strength, turning every act of resistance against her into proof she was being wrong. The middle of that war was a room with no windows inside my head. Every morning I woke with my heart pounding like someone had called to report a fire, opened my email to find another motion, another request for documents, another affidavit, another relative suddenly recalling that my father had seemed very devoted to Victoria's security. I worked remotely for a small firm part-time just to keep money moving. At night I sat with Maya building timelines, marking gate code changes, messages, locksmith invoices, doctor appointments, flight logs from Nantucket. Some days I couldn't remember what I had eaten. Some days I stood in the detergent aisle at Stop and Shop unable to remember whether I'd come for laundry soap or bread. Meanwhile, Victoria stayed in the house, still using the white linen tablecloth, still having the grass cut every Thursday, still sending tulips to other people's homes when their children graduated, as if there were no one being slowly crushed by paper in her wake. The worst suffocation was not the fear of losing. It was having to live inside two realities at once. One where I knew exactly what she was doing, and one where the entire civilized, well-mannered world around us still saw her as the widow who needed protection from the unruly stepdaughter. Maya had been right. Liars with good posture do win the first rounds, and without a visible fracture, the fight would drain me empty before the law ever reached the truth. The fracture, when it came, did not come from the paper itself. It came from contempt. During discovery, we demanded original scan metadata for the codicil and the memorandum of intent. Victoria's firm delayed, reformatted, blamed an outdated system. Maya pushed, the judge signed the order. Eventually, the original files were turned over. The metadata on the memorandum showed the document had been created 3 weeks after my father's death, on a computer registered to user initials V.C. Their side immediately argued it had merely been typed up after the fact from a handwritten note. Maya didn't bother arguing yet. She just smiled the way people do when they smell the first drop of blood. Then came the cameras, the old security system in the house, which everyone assumed wiped after 10 days, turned out to have been backed up by an outside vendor because my father had once sued an insurance company over a stolen wine case. Maya dug it up. The footage from the night after the funeral showed Victoria entering the study at 11:47 p.m. with a red file box, going down to the basement with that same box at 11:58. There was no camera inside the furnace room, but she came back up at 12:14 with the box empty. In that same sequence, she opened the secondary locked drawer in my father's desk with her own key, removed a slim folder, and slipped it into the pocket of her coat. I watched that footage 7 times and felt the same revulsion rise each time. Not because I finally had proof, but because the truth looked exactly like the feeling I had carried from the beginning. She had not been swept into some desperate circumstance. She had done this in silence, in rhythm, without haste, like someone who knew in advance what she needed to take and what she could burn. Maya closed the laptop and looked at me. "There it is," she said. She knew exactly what she was doing. That sentence should have relieved me. Instead, it made me sad in a clean, hollow way, because the last part of me that had still hoped this was only ambition mixed with panic died there. Victoria was not lost. She was deliberate. The private deposition before the main hearing took place in a conference room on the 16th floor of the county civil courthouse. A place so cold it felt designed to strip emotion off people before they could use it as a weapon. Victoria arrived in a pale gray suit, hair smoothed, lips nude, looking, to anyone who didn't know better, like an elegant widow being harassed by her husband's obsessed daughter. Maya told me to answer only when needed, not to look at Victoria too much. But some confrontations are not about winning more evidence. They are about finally seeing in full what you have been smelling for too long. When Maya presented the metadata, Victoria did not collapse. She merely tilted her head like a teacher listening to an intelligent student, solve the wrong problem. Technical inconsistencies happen, she said. When Maya showed the footage from the study, Victoria's hand tightened once around her water glass. Very small. I was organizing Richard's affairs. And the empty box, Maya asked. Victoria met her eyes. I grieved how I needed to grieve. That was Victoria's method. Turn any suspicious act into a private ritual of mourning so that anyone pressing further looked monstrous. In the end, Maya cut through the layers with one question. Did Richard Halpern ever verbally tell you the house belonged to Lena before you presented the revised codicil? Just one beat. One blink. He said many contradictory things under stress, Victoria answered. I spoke before Maya could stop me. You knew he never meant to leave you the house. The whole room turned toward me. Victoria looked at me. For the first time in the entire war, I saw something close to real contempt on her face. No widow now, just a woman who hated being seen clearly by the person she had chosen to crush. No, she said, her voice lower, cleaner, more brutal than any shout. I knew he was weak with you. There's a difference. Maya nudged my chair with her shoe to shut me up, but I had heard enough. Statements like that rarely go into the official record. They are made to leave private bruises. And strangely, because I had heard it out loud, I was less afraid of her afterward. She wasn't invincible. She was only used to other people being too polite to stay in the room. Once the soft varnish began to peel. The day of the hearing itself, June felt humid enough to glue a shirt to your back just from the walk between the parking garage and the courthouse door. I wore a dark blue dress, my hair tied back, makeup light, just enough that no one could call the exhaustion on my face instability. The courtroom was not large. Light wood, white overhead light, 2 rows of seating for observers. A few relatives were there. Harold Green, Martha, Jonathan Pierce, some former staff from my father's office, and Victoria at the opposing table with her attorneys. The judge, Helen Roswell, was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a dry voice. The type of person tears tend to annoy more than persuade. Maya moved through the case like someone disarming a device with paperwork. She presented the codicil, my father's medical timeline, the time-stamped Nantucket photo, the old writer separating the house from marital property, Harold's email to Jonathan, the security footage, the file metadata, Martha's statement about the burned papers. Victoria's side argued my father had changed his mind later, that the footage showed no specific content being removed, that the handwritten intent could have been typed up after the fact. Then Maya waited until their confidence peaked and called Jonathan Pierce. He looked older than the first time I had seen him after the funeral. But when he sat in the witness chair, his spine was still straight with old discipline. Maya took him through the background cleanly. Then she introduced the email from 3 years earlier about segregating the house file. Jonathan confirmed it. Then came notes from a meeting with my father 6 months before his death, in Jonathan's own hand, in the margin of his legal pad. House to Lena to remain outside V's exposure. Opposing counsel objected, claiming attorney-client privilege. Roswell reviewed it at the bench and let part of it in. The room went very still when Jonathan, after almost 2 full minutes of silence long enough for the low hum of the ceiling system to become audible, said the sentence that shifted the entire gravity of the day. Richard Halpern did not instruct me to leave the house to Victoria. He instructed me repeatedly, over several years, that the house was to go to his daughter, Lena. I don't know why I kept thinking I would feel a violent rush of satisfaction when I heard that sentence. I didn't. What I felt was a cold sorrow all the way to the bone, because it took this, under oath among strangers, for me to receive a sentence my father had spoken to me dozens of times in the kitchen, in the yard, in the basement. And when it still could have spared me all of this, no one had been willing to stand up and confirm it. Victoria still did not break. She wasn't a woman who broke where people could watch. She tried one last time with the oldest weapon she had, moralizing greed. She stood and gave a supplemental statement, her voice trembling just enough. I took care of Richard when his own daughter chose distance. I kept that house alive while she built a life elsewhere. I did not steal anything. I protected what he and I built together. If Helen Roswell had been the kind of judge moved by beautifully delivered personal grief, it might have gone badly for me. But instead she asked one question. Then why were the original house records removed? And why was a new memorandum generated posthumously on a device registered to you? Victoria opened her mouth, then shut it. Her lawyer stepped in. Roswell's tone stayed flat and almost cruel in its precision. No, counsel. I asked her, That was the moment the air around Victoria cracked open. Not a collapse, just a woman discovering, for the first time, that she no longer had a room in which to set the light on her own terms. "I was trying to secure stability," she said at last. Roswell looked down at the file. "For whom?" That question dropped into the middle of the room like something metallic and heavy. Victoria did not answer. Maya did not miss the opening. "You didn't just lie," she said, turning fully toward her. "You stole," not loud, not theatrical, but enough for the whole room to hear one final word that no longer hid behind grief, practicality, or confusion. The ruling came 3 weeks later. The house was mine. The codicil related to its disposition was voided due to unreliable evidence, manipulated document chain, and proof that my father's consistent intent had run in the opposite direction. Additional discovery into concealment of records was moved into separate review. Victoria did not go to prison. Real life is rarely that generous with people who have good lawyers and long money. But she lost the one thing she had really wanted: the right to remain the dignified widow in the big house facing the rose garden, holding the keys to my father's memory, and telling everyone else who deserved to belong inside. Relatives who had doubted me called and texted. A few gave vague apologies. A few disappeared entirely, because the shame of wealthy adults is usually expressed through absence rather than confession. Martha came back for one day to help me open every room, take inventory, note what remained and what was gone. Some drawers were empty in a way that physically hurt to look at. Some photographs of my mother had been moved to the basement. Some books my father had annotated in pencil had been marked with Victoria's color-coded sticky tabs and left on tables like a final act of occupation. I walked through room after room and felt no triumph, only the aftermath of theft, where what had been taken was not just objects. It was the old, innocent feeling that a house could wait for you without changing its nature. I did not move back immediately. It took nearly 4 months before I spent my first night alone in my old bedroom, staring at the pale ceiling in the dark, and listening to the pipes whisper in the walls the same way they had when I was 15. In the months between the ruling and returning, I hired people to inspect the roof, wiring, plumbing, alarm system, had certain rooms repainted, removed some of the things Victoria had chosen, kept only what my father had genuinely touched. His writing desk, the leather chair in the library, the small wooden ship on the mantel, the old GL, asses in the pantry, the cedar smell in the basement. People from the outside think getting your house back must feel complete. It doesn't. Justice, when it comes at all, does not work like resurrection. It only stops a crime from being completed. It does not restore the version of you that existed before you had to learn how to fight evil spoken in a gentle voice. On that first night back, I went downstairs barefoot at 2:14 a.m., turned on the kitchen faucet, stood in the room where my father had said again and again that the house would stay with me, and realized I could still hear Victoria in my head whenever I touched anything. This place is too much for one person. The house is an asset, not shrine. Grief makes memory unreliable. Some people leave your life, and their voices remain in the architecture of your mind longer than their bodies ever did. That may be the deepest victory they win, if you do not learn to name it correctly and fight it every day after. Victoria disappeared from Riverside after the ruling. I heard she went to Palm Beach for a while, then returned and rented a smaller townhouse in Greenwich. No one told me directly, but information of that kind always circles back to you in towns where everyone knows each other's home prices before they know each other's dog's name. I saw her only once after the hearing, in the hallway outside a gallery fundraiser I had to attend because my mother's scholarship fund still carried the family name. Victoria wore a black baton-neck dress. A single strand of pearls, looked thinner, sharper, beautiful in the way people look after bitterness has pared them down. She saw me from one end of the hallway, the space between us no more than 6 paces, and yet somehow like the distance between 2 ends of a burned bridge. "You got what you wanted," she said when she passed close enough. I looked straight at her. "No, I only took back what you tried to steal." Victoria paused so slightly that anyone watching would have thought she was adjusting her handbag. Then she turned toward me, her eyes lit with the most dangerous expression of all, the one worn by someone stripped of every role except the naked truth. "Careful," she said. "Houses like that don't keep people warm. They keep them haunted." I didn't answer, because for the first time, though I hated admitting it, I knew she was right about part of it. And sentences that are partly true are always the ones that linger the longest. If I'm going to tell the truth all the way through, Then the cruelest thing was not Victoria trying to take my house. It wasn't the relatives turning away, the lawyer hedging, or the fact that I had to drag my father's memory into court like a disputed possession. The cruelest thing was that over the course of that war, I felt myself becoming, in certain ways, more like the things I hated. I learned how to stay silent long enough for other people to say too much. I learned how to wait for exactly the right moment to release a piece of evidence, instead of spilling everything at once. I learned to look at people first in terms of risk, motive, weakness, leverage. Surviving manipulators doesn't only make you stronger. It damages a few softer parts of you in ways you never get to fully reverse. I still have the house. I replanted the South Rose garden the following spring with the same heirloom variety my mother once loved. I restored the study, changed the locks, stored the papers in a new safe under my own name. I work remotely 3 days a week and go into the city for the rest. From the outside, my life might look like a satisfying story. Greedy stepmother fails, daughter reclaims her home, truth wins. But the real cost does not live in the headline. It lives in the nights when you walk through a dark hallway and can no longer tell how much of your vigilance is wisdom and how much is trauma. It lives in the fact that a house can return to your name and never return to its original innocence. It lives in the way your stomach tightens every time someone says, "She probably meant well," as if a wall has cracked somewhere behind you. Now, if someone asks what happened, I can tell the short version, polished enough for dinner tables where no one wants to smell blood inside the law. I can say my stepmother tried to seize the house my father meant to leave to me, concealed records, rewrote part of reality, and in the end failed because documents, witnesses, and time were on my side. All of that is true, but the truth is longer and colder than that. She did not just try to take a piece of property. She tried to take the last place that still held a version of my life, in which my father existed as a promise instead of a file. She tried to turn memory into dispute, trust into a mental health issue, me from daughter into obstacle. And I beat her, if beating means forcing the law to call her actions by the right name. But I did not step out whole. I stepped out with the house, with the keys, with a clean deed, with the garden, with the study, with the kitchen window looking out over the hydrangeas, and with something gone that exists in no legal document at all. The innocence to believe that home is the place where you never have to bring evidence to be believed. Victoria tried to take my house. What she really did, as I've come to understand more and more clearly in the years since, was strip bare a truth I had probably needed to know long before this, but never wanted to learn this way. Some people do not enter your life to love you. They enter to measure how much of you can be converted into ownership if they are patient enough. She failed, but her failure did not restore me to who I had been before. It only left me alive inside the old house as a newer version of myself, sharper, colder, harder to fool, and permanently aware that sometimes truth is not light. Sometimes it is only the one hard thing left sturdy enough to keep you from falling any farther.